Hello, I am your proud superintendent, Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez. I am leading the crucial process of reimagining and restructuring our school district. I need you, all of you, to be significant partners in our process. We are doing this imperative work to deliver on our commitment to ensure improved student outcomes and equitable access to resources for each and every one of our beautiful and capable students. When we have completed this process together, we will hold in our hands a stronger, more equitable school district designed to serve all students well, a plan built by the entire community that will benefit the entire community. We at Hartford Public Schools are coordinating the process, but you, the community, families, students, teachers, and all of our stakeholders are the voices and the minds that must inform this work. By sharing your thoughts, you will help to co-create our district model. Our work together, which takes place over the coming months in community meetings with families, partners, and schools, will culminate in the presentation of recommendations for district models for excellence, different ways in which the district can be reimagined while ensuring the health and viability of our neighborhoods, and continuing to provide access to opportunities and services for our families and students. For news about meetings and ongoing updates on our process, please visit our district website at www.hartfordschools.org.
Order. Because today is a workshop meeting and not a regular meeting, there will be no public comment tonight. We will have a public hearing tomorrow. So if you came for public comment, tomorrow's meeting would be the more appropriate meeting for that. So tonight, the second order of business, what we're going to do is we're going to swear in our new board members, and we're going to start with Ms. Shante Brody.
That you will faithfully discharge, according to law, your duties as a member of the Hartford Board of Education to the best of your abilities, so help you God, or upon penalty of perjury. I do. Congratulations. That was
And next we have Aisha Clark. Thank you so much. And so with that, we're going to move on to item number 3, which is the workshop. Madam Superintendent, you have the floor.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. We certainly have had countless of feedback sessions, planning sessions, difficult and honest conversations to get to where we are tonight. And so thank you to Principal Heredia for hosting us tonight. And before I get on with some introductions of our guests and actually some of our thought partners here tonight, I want to remind us that the process getting here and actually moving forward is one that will remain focused around encouraging voice, fostering leadership, and building our future together. Tonight's workshop will allow the board, all of you, to ask any clarifying questions from last board meeting, the presentation and the recommendations that I made. Also will allow for a deeper understanding with regard to the state, if you will, around some of our magnet schools. In particular, there have been questions around the district model of excellence and the recommendations and potential implications and what that means for our magnet schools, given that we know we exist within a larger ecosystem, right? We have our neighborhood schools, we have our magnet schools, and so we certainly wanted to make sure that we have a broader understanding of the entire landscape in which all of our students are educated in. And so, we know that we wanted to have a broader conversation, and so tonight we have the platform to engage in those conversations. We wanted to make sure that we brought other stakeholders to the table into the conversation so that we can get an idea of that bigger picture that I refer to often. And so we wanted to have here with us tonight representative from the State Department of Education. And so we have here several attorneys from the State Department of Education, Peter Haberland, Robin Cecier, Chief Operating Officer Charlene Russell Tucker is here, and I believe at some point from the Department of Administrative Services, the Office of School Construction Grants Review, Costas Diamantis will be here as well. So I wanted to make sure that I reference again the fact that the processes, decisions, and recommendations, right, are not solely around finances. We have an imperative to serve all of our students and to serve them well in all of our schools. And so the recommendations help us to, yes, right-size our district, but also they get us to a point in which we can take a critical examination of what to expect ultimately in terms of high-quality teaching and learning for all of our students. We know that some of our schools, neighborhood and magnets, offer great programming for our students. This is not about who offers the best programming and who doesn't, right? This was about making sure that we level it for all of our students within the challenging context that we have. So I wanted just to make sure that we remind ourselves to remain grounded in those commitments that we had when we engaged in this process. So just to give an overview of the agenda, tonight I'd like to review some of the restructuring recommendations that I made back in December, and to share more about rationale for some of those recommendations. Also to discuss magnet school opportunities and implications that exist within the larger context, including what it is that we know about recruitment and enrollment patterns, compliance trends and implications, as well, of course, as financial implications, so that we can achieve that goal of a network, a collection of schools in Hartford Public Schools that are all excellent schools for our students. And so we have to fully understand all of our schools in their context, and also review next steps in the process. Of course, before I review any of the recommendations, I want to remind us that our district is faced with ongoing challenges, and so every time that we engage in change, you have to think about the why, right? What's the urgency behind the change? And so just want to call to mind that we have deep student needs that call for us to be equipped to have the resources necessary. And when I use the word resources, I mean the people, the time, and the money, right? What it is that we do with all of those to meet the deep needs that our students have. Another challenge for us is the fact that we have persistently low student performance. Yes, when we look at some schools in isolation, some schools are performing higher and are achieving at higher levels than others. Others are not. And so for us, we want all of our schools to perform at high levels for our students. And so that requires, given our need, right, the fact that we service a very high need compared with other state districts that serve the same population, high number of students that are English learners, high number of students that are special education students, and then the fact that we have a high concentration of need in terms of our students that live in poverty. All of that together require us to have additional services and programming for our students. And then, of course, the other reality around our declining enrollment. knowing that in the last 4 years, we have had a decrease of 15%, 2,000 students in terms of the decline in our enrollment, which cause other challenges for us when we think about all of the resources that we have to make sure we maximize. Just like we talk about every minute in the classroom counts, every dollar counts, right? So that we can make sure that our students have the best that they can and that they deserve. Checking in on the process and where we are. This is part of our feedback phase still. After I made the initial recommendations, the board certainly is going to engage in hearing from our respective, all of you, all of our stakeholders, and then that will inform their decision making, which will allow us to move forward to implementation phase. And again, want to reference our commitment that when we move into implementation phase, that also will entail collaboration, and our design teams, if you will be school-based with community member input, and of course, parent and student involvement as well. We have certainly received questions about the next phase of the work, so just to share some details, certainly our commitment to the community is to engage and partner. And in order to improve our network of schools, we know that it takes our stakeholders. And so with that said, we know that not only based on our research, but based on what we have heard from all of you of what makes a great school, we know that family and community partnerships matters to you. It certainly matters to us. We know that as one of our priorities. We have elevated that commitment right alongside high quality teaching and learning. And so after any of the restructuring decisions are made, the district will begin to strategically design and plan for the district model of excellence. And so that will entail the collaborative strategic school design teams. Not only will that have, they'll be comprised of our district staff, but we certainly will have our school and community partners so that all of the programming and the uses of the resources will be informed by all of the stakeholders that consume the educational experiences for our students. I am going to, just for the board, rush through, but know that I have included an extensive amount of the slides from the last presentation, given that in case you have any specific questions, we can refer back. And so it's not that I'm rushing through here, but you have them in your packet. We have, after I, just for logistics in terms of the presentation, after I review some of the highlights from the last meeting, do know that ERS, our partners, our data partners are here. And so ERS, as you know, Educational Resource Strategies, are here, and they're going to walk us through some specific data that they have mined for us around our magnet schools. So I'll cue you up in a little bit. So these were the guiding principles that were defined by our community, making sure that we have great teaching and learning in every school, that we have safe and equitable access to great schools and pathways. And just to spend a minute here with regard to safe and equitable access, certainly heard about safety in terms of our students feeling safe, feeling that they have voice. Parents felt that yes, welcoming and safe environments mattered, but parents also saw safety with regard to security in terms of a pathway for their students, particularly for our parents in our neighborhood schools. Parents felt that they were not sure, they were not safe what it was that they were signing up for in terms of the progression for their students from elementary to middle to high school. Also a priority that emerged was around expanded family and community partnerships. We heard loud and clear that if there were changes to happen to any of our schools, that we had to make sure that not only that we kept the community-based supports and resources in the schools, but that we should also look to expand given the need that we have in our schools. And lastly, of course, we heard about fiscal sustainability and the fact that we wanted to make sure that however many programs in schools remain, that we are able to operate not just next year, not just 2 years from now, right? That we have a plan for long-term sustainability so that we can meet the needs of our students. And so these certainly were the guiding principles that served as the foundation for the model of excellence, which then informed. That my clicker doesn't work. Did it freeze? Thank you. So like I said, yes, we want to acknowledge that we have great models and best practices in schools already, but we don't have them in every school. And we certainly have a lot of work to do. Based on what we have heard, these became the non-negotiables. And knowing that we have a commitment to improve high-quality teaching and learning, we do have programmatic non-negotiables. That is what we want to see in terms of programs, making sure that we intensify our focus around making sure that our students know how to read and do math, right? And we focus intensely in the lower grades so that we can have a solid foundation. Also in terms of our middle grades programming, especially given that we don't have it now. We certainly don't have middle school programming in isolation, robust middle school programming, and given the enrollment trends that we have had, we know that in our K-8 design, current design, we are not able to provide our students with a robust, well-rounded middle school programming that services and that meets their not only academic learning needs, but also their social and emotional and physical needs. And then for programmatic high school, making sure that we augment, that we improve college and career preparation and access for our students, and followed by health and wellness opportunities for our students. We also wanted to call out some practice non-negotiables based on the feedback that we heard, certainly around our community. And you've heard me reference the vision around every school being a community school and having those elements so that we can meet the needs of not only our students, but also family needs as well. Making sure that we engage in an adult culture that is one focused on learning. Of course, within this collaborative adult learning culture comes accountability and continuous improvement, and making sure that we hold ourselves accountable to what it is that we said we were going to do, and to improving our practice. And then, of course, around partnerships and making sure that there's a framework for how it is that we partner, not only with our community-based organizations, with our funders, with our families. And lastly, we do have to call out the operational non-negotiables. And this we heard as well from your feedback as to how it is that we as a district should do our work, right? What is it that we're gonna do, and how are we gonna run our schools, manage our district in service of our students. And so we heard capacity and making sure that we operate our schools in a way that makes sense, that are healthy fiscally, right? We're not going to operate more schools than are necessary because we can't afford them. We can't afford that anymore. And so we heard that we had to make sure that we understood what we have a capacity to do for our students. We also, of course, heard the pathways and the need for pathways that make sense for our parents, our families, and grade configurations also that make sense. And then, of course, we heard access, making sure that all of our students have access to high quality, magnet, non-magnet, north, south, wherever in our city, that they are high quality teaching and learning experiences, and that we increase the amount of those experiences year round. So as you can see, we have our 4 principles and our non-negotiables. And just some clarification, through some of the feedback that we have heard, there have been questions around, well, our school does this. Why is it that our school is being recommended for this or that? And so I wanted to clarify that this is not a checklist that we use to determine schools and recommendations. This is what we heard from the community matters most. And when I speak of community, we have heard higher ed, our university folks, we have heard our parents, we have heard our staff, certainly your board, our students. And so this is where this originates from. It's not that we said, this is how we're going to evaluate our current school. So I just wanted to have the opportunity to clarify that. Just a picture here of our current state. And so as you know, this is our map of our neighborhood schools. And you can see, right, we have all kinds of grade configurations here. And while it does create choice for our families, it also creates a lot of complexity that everyone, from our families to our educators and even our partners, have to manage. So more than 80% of our neighborhood middle grade students attend a pre-K-8 school. And right now, the average pre-K-5 grade size is 50 students per grade. So some of our schools have 50 students in, say, grade 2. When we look at grade 6 through 8, our middle grades, we have on average 44 students per grade. And in isolation, we might think, right, that's great for either small grade sizes, more attention for students. However, when we look at programming and we look at that from the impact that can have on the quality of experience that students can have and should have, we know that it becomes very difficult for many reasons to operate this model, for example, for a middle school student. We know what we have heard from our community is the desire to support rigorous instruction. Our parents told us over and over again, high quality teaching and learning. Challenge my child. We heard that over and over again. Regardless of whether or not the child is at grade level, we did hear, I want you to challenge my child and provide the supports that are necessary for my child. And so we know that in the current design, given the enrollment in our grades, that provides a challenge for us, right? In small schools, students lack access to more diverse electives and those enrichment opportunities. Teachers certainly have less opportunity for collaboration and less flexibility to provide those intensive supports, small group support, and interventions for our students. And we know all of those are foundational structures that are necessary for the rigorous instruction and rigorous experiences that we know our students need. And so going to an elementary middle school model, which is part of the recommendation that I made, we can offer a wider range of course offerings, certainly with more flexibility for teachers to learn from and with one another, for personalized instruction for students, for the after-school activities and enrichment and added supports that we need for our students. In the new network, we do recommend operating 4 dedicated middle schools, neighborhood middle schools in each zone, and going from an average of 44 students to an average of 128 students per grade. And then knowing that we have one middle school, McDonough, that is currently a middle school configuration. And so it just shows you here the added 3 that I'm proposing. This would also require that we expand our current pre-K-5 model to all zones. And in order to support our babies, right, our younger students, we will expand and have a couple benefits with this, knowing that grade sizes will increase. I'm not speaking about class size, right? So hear me, grade sizes can increase. That will help create larger teacher teams for collaboration. I know that oftentimes I hear, so does this mean that we're going to go to 28, 30 kids in the classroom? That is not what we're saying. We want to make sure that our entire grade has added students so that we can allow for the flexibility for our teachers. And while school sizes will not change dramatically, our new elementary school model can create a more age-appropriate environment for our younger learners, while of course the middle school students get the very unique supports that they need. And I just want to be clear that when we think about the pre-K-5 and the 6-8 model, there are certainly risks, right? There are risks with any transition that we engage in. And we know that a transition from a 5th grade to 6th grade is probably one of the most sensitive ones, right? When you think developmentally of our students. And so it's when also our families look outside of our system to leave our system. And so they look to leave for other alternatives. And so it's important for us to focus on a structure district-wide that creates state-of-the-art, high-quality experiences for our middle school students. We are, I know that this is something that other board members have referenced, but we are also looking to improve the quality of our schools so that we can retain our students. And so just making it transparent for everyone that is also not only is it a commitment and the expectation that everyone should have for us as a school system for our students, but we want to make sure that we do so with that intention as well. Students would continue to have access to 3 neighborhood schools with a pre-K-8 configuration. There certainly has been some wondering around honoring the legacy of those that our schools are named after, and so there is a recommendation here that we honor and preserve the names of schools that are closed in a future model. There is a recommendation for Milner, current Milner, to move to become a Milner Middle School, and preserving that name. And so there are others that we can have additional conversation around. A high school configuration, which we all know as we anticipate Weaver coming online, so that we can have the progressions which are highlighted here. This, by 2020, clearly we can have clearer pathways for all of our students in our neighborhood schools. And certainly our students would still have options available through our choice process. But as you can see, it's a clearer pathway for our students. And so by moving out of some of the facilities, we are able to recapture the investment in maintenance and ongoing upkeep that we have, that we would have to invest, if you will, in learning, right? So right now, there's a certain amount of money that we have to operate our facilities, and so this is something that we can think through around reinvesting recaptured resources. And just to highlight a few data points here in terms of the use of facilities, we would go from 68% of our seats being filled to 82% of our seats being filled. And in terms of the quality of the facilities, You know, when facilities are ranked 4 or number 5, those are the worst condition for facilities, and so this would take us from 10 to 4 buildings in the lowest category rating. We think also in terms of added resources that we could potentially invest, and so $11 million. If we increase the number of students in our schools and in grades, then we could potentially be very strategic in how we staff to support our students and our priorities. I know that there was a question with regard to specific staff, and so when we had ERS look at the data for us over the 3 years in which we implement this model, you know, we could have up to 90 teachers that could become available to either take up personalized learning and student support roles in our schools. And so combined, potentially $15 million annually at the end to support high priority investments. And I also want to reference here that these are examples of how we can invest in our schools. This again is not a list or a checklist that was used to say if schools do not have these, or do schools have these. So I just wanted to clarify that. We know that these are some best practices that can help, especially for high needs populations. And so again, these are some examples of what it is that we can invest in. And this is a larger view of the recommendations that I made over the 3 years. And of course, this allows for a sequencing and staging the shifts in a logical way, and also that take into consideration our capacity to make transitions that are collaboratively and also responsive to transitions, not only for our families, for our staff, for our community partners. We are going to talk in a little bit more deeply about the magnets, but I wanted to also reference the Model of Excellence does recommend co-location in order to improve access to facilities that are of higher quality. And so proposal for 5 co-locations of neighborhood schools and magnet schools. And so this would take the number of our magnet students in top-ranked facilities from 11,000 to 13,000 students. And of course, there are some opportunities: shared athletic facilities, extracurricular clubs, community school resources. This, by the way, is the model that we have been working and collaborating with the State Department of Education and the Office, Department of Administrative Services, around the design for Weaver and Martin Luther King campuses. Just want to spend a little bit on clarification for recommendations, and the recommendations were based upon 2 factors, 2 major drivers. One was the comprehensive study of our current state, which, by the way, per board policy is required before any school closures can be recommended. And of course, input from all of you regarding our collective priorities. The recommendations were not formulaic. You know, I know that in the past there have been reform efforts in Hartford Public Schools in which performance-driven metrics have been used. Very narrow and specific metrics have been used. This is not the way that we approach this process. I was very clear when we engaged in this process that we were not going to engage in that type of decision making. Rather, each recommendation was informed by findings in the comprehensive study, community priorities, the guiding principles, and of course our non-negotiables. And while, of course, alternate recommendations can be made, and you can look at it from so many different perspectives, factors and trade-offs, such as the current alignment with the guiding principles, the use of seats and access in each of the zone, the number of students and families that would be impacted by changes, availability of alternate seats in other zones, the level of the building use, the condition of the facility, how resources are currently provided for our student needs. So all of those were considered in order to make the most informed recommendations possible. And so while I can understand that people, right, you probably also as well are wondering, you know, is there a list and is there a checklist, right? It was not, and it is not that simple. I know that, you know, we wanted to make sure that we were holistic in our approach, and I know that there was a lot of intentionality making sure that we didn't approach this the way that we approached the work, the district, right, approached the work with Equity 2020, right, very specific in terms of performance, of facility, and enrollment, and so this was broader than that. And while we looked at performance as a data point, it was not used for recommendations. You know, performance was looked from the angle of what is it that our schools need in order to meet performance needs of our schools. So just wanted to clarify into how we used performance data. And certainly it's going to be a key data point moving forward when we think about how we design the schools moving forward. Just want to point clarification. You know, I have, in terms of a comprehensive rationale, the saturation of seats and the access. And so what I mean by saturation is the number of seat opportunities that exist within an area, within a zone, so that we can try to maintain an adequate access of seats throughout the city. So the next objective of our workshop is to discuss the magnet school opportunities and implications. We know that magnets are part of our district and they serve our students, right, our Hartford students. And so we want to make sure that we're mindful and when we plan within the larger context that we exist in. And so magnet schools come with a very specific set of structure, constraints, conditions, and they certainly impact our decision making relative to building excellence throughout our district. And when we think about right-sizing our district, and so based on some of your specific questions and requests to discuss the magnets, you know, I know that ERS has mined very specific data for us, but I certainly want to highlight the fact that our representatives from the state are here also as well to answer any questions that you might have. So I'm going to ask ERS to David Rosenberg to facilitate. Swap. Don't make me throw it down. Come on, can you? Let's not throw. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Is this good?
I could have got it there eventually.
No throwing.
I would have caught it, I promise. The superintendent and board members, thank you for having us here. So again, my name is David Rosenberg. For those of you who are new and others who are listening, I'm a partner at Education Resource Strategies. So as many of you know, we're a nonprofit organization. We work with large urban school districts and their leaders all over the country on issues related to how resources are used. So as the superintendent said, people, time, and money. That work takes many forms. The districts with whom we work range in size from 10,000 to well over 100,000 students. Some are facing declining enrollment, as you are in Hartford. Some are managing with increasing enrollment. Some are in very low-funded states. Some are in higher-funded states. And as the superintendent said, we've had the privilege to work alongside the team over the last several months in supporting the work around developing the district model for excellence. As we go through this, a couple of points of framing. One is this analysis is a direct response to questions from the board in our last session on December 19th, where we talked about, and the superintendent talked about plans for the district model for excellence, and there were questions about, well, what more could we be thinking about for magnet schools? So we've taken a step back and looked at some of the data. I want to acknowledge that we are providing the information to inform the conversation, and this is an important conversation happening here. So what you won't see in the next several pages are recommendations from ERS. We're trying to inform the work that you're doing. And of course, the superintendent, I encourage you to jump in at any point, and I'm happy to take questions as we go, if that's appropriate. So we'll start by looking at the current state. This is a map of the magnet schools that HPS currently operates. It does not include Great Path, which is a little bit of an exception, and Pathways is in East Hartford, so it's not depicted here. But this is the universe that we're dealing with today of the district's magnet schools. So and this is content that you saw earlier in our last session, as the district thinks about applying guiding principles that the superintendent described to magnet schools and the work of the district of model of excellence, there are several options you have. And the goal of magnet schools is, well, how do we figure out how to increase access to our highest performing programs for kids in Hartford? How do you do so while being aware of and maintaining compliance with the Sheff ruling, and also thinking about the fiscal implications for the district? And so we've outlined here a few different options. I'll note one language change on the page as we get to it. So we thought about a few different options, and these are challenging choices. The first is in magnet schools, presumably the district could move to an elementary and middle school model instead of a pre-K-8 or K-8 model. That would mirror what's the proposal for most of your neighborhood schools. This is pros and cons, as these all do, right? So if you do that, we have the potential to we'll be displacing students from one school to another by shifting the grade configurations of schools. As we'll see, you have a risk around will some schools fall into or out of compliance with Sheff, and we'll talk about the percentage of reduced isolation kids in different grade levels in a moment. What you would get is some simplicity in alignment with the pathways in neighborhood schools. The incremental cost of this is small to none, and there are obviously costs associated with recruiting into magnet schools and transporting children to magnet schools and managing sort of central services around that. That dollar amount pales in comparison to some of the other costs associated with the other options. So there are fiscal implications here. The impact on a relative basis and incrementally is relatively small here. But the second option that's on the table is, and this is where there's a language shift I want to point out, is you can continue to recruit and try to retain students who count as reduced isolation students in your model. I believe your page printed on row 2 says reduced isolation students in both the first and the fourth.
It's been updated.
Column? Okay. Oh, great. Lovely. So in doing so, there's no change in access for suburban students. We continue to recruit non-Hartford residents, and if we can do that, we can create more access for Hartford residents, right? Because you have the numerator of reduced isolation students goes up, and you're in compliance. You can bring in more students from within Hartford. And this is a case where the dollars start being large. Every time HPS recruits or serves a non-Hartford resident in the school, the state provides an additional $13,000 for that student. And so your ability to do this is also has a potential revenue impact. The other options on the table involve moving away from magnet status, right? And they have different implications, but the general theme here is there's a big financial implication. You're likely to lose non-Hartford residents, and what happens for Hartford residents will vary. So, for example, if you were to change a magnet school from current magnet to an open choice school, there's a possibility, as there always is, that your non-Hartford resident students would move out of the school. You would potentially create more access for your Hartford residents because you wouldn't be thinking about chef compliance. But for every single student not living in Hartford who is in that school, the district loses a $10,000 benefit from the state, regardless of whether that student is reduced isolation or not, regardless of the incremental change. Every student in that school now who lives outside of Hartford, the funding goes down. So that becomes can be a significant hit financially to the district from your current state. The fourth option here is to change the school to a neighborhood school. And in doing so, your non-Hartford residents basically, potentially, and likely would go back to their home districts. So we get a lot more access for our Hartford residents. There may be some attrition, right? We're losing some diversity in the schools. Is one of the things that makes our schools strong, and is sort of the underpinning of the court ruling. But for every suburban student, every non-Hartford resident who moves out of that school, the district now loses $13,000. And that $3,000 difference is the benefit that the district gets when a non-Hartford resident comes to an open choice program. And then the last option, of course, you could just discontinue the program altogether. Everybody loses access to that program, and the dollars for the suburban students go away. So I know we have many attorneys here, and I would absolutely defer to those with legal experience to clarify or correct or go deeper on any of these issues, but these are the basic parameters that we thought about with the team in the context of the planning for the district model for excellence. There is no path here that is so obviously easier or more attractive than anything else, which is one of the reasons I think that this deeper conversation was merited.
Yeah, and the initial question was around, well, what would the model of excellence, what are the implications when we think about pathways and access and making sure that even the students in our magnet schools do have access to high quality facilities. And so it was looking at it from multiple angles, while acknowledging, right, that we know that our students have great opportunities in some of our magnets as well. And so these are opportunities within the current construct.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
So this brings us back to our current state of our magnet schools. And so you'll notice the slide earlier had 19 schools. We're talking about 17 schools here. 2 of the schools actually reside in 2 different locations, which explains the discrepancy. But as with the neighborhood schools, you have a wide variety of grade configurations among the magnet schools today. You see total enrollment there. If you wanted to do the back of the envelope math, you could see that many of these schools are relatively small, right? So for an elementary or K-8 school, once you get below about 350 kids, it starts becoming more resource intensive to support the school. That's a choice that many districts make, but it's a choice we encourage districts to make with eyes wide open. And you could also see that the average percentage of students who qualify as reduced isolation in each of these types of schools varies quite widely, and in many cases hovers right around that 25%, in some cases lower, which I know is an issue that the district has been wrestling with. So the model for excellence, as it was currently defined, says, you know, as you talked about in the superintendent recapped, many changes for neighborhood schools largely focused on grade configuration. The main shift with magnet schools has been, let's create co-location opportunities for neighborhood and magnet schools together. And so that's what's reflected here right now, with one shift in grade configuration and one closure in the current model for excellence. I think the question on the table is there more or additional types of shifts that you want to consider at this point in time? So this brings us to the issue of how the district works to bring reduced isolation students into their magnet schools. And so given the nature of the population of the greater Hartford area, that strategy involves, as we alluded to, and what the state incentives are around, is for bringing in students who are not Hartford residents into Hartford magnet schools. And the theory of that would be that as we do that, we're going to bring in students who would be qualifying as reduced isolation, and that will help us with compliance and create a diverse educational opportunity for our students. The charts you're looking at here are two snapshots. The first one from the left is 2014, and the second is 2017. Each dot is a school in each case, and what you're looking at is for each school, along the horizontal axis, what percentage of kids are not Hartford residents, and along the vertical axis is what percentage of students qualify as reduced isolation. And then the trend line shows you the relationship between the two. And as you can see, the big takeaway here is that there is no relationship on a school-by-school basis between the proportion of students who come from outside Hartford and the proportion of students who qualify as reduced isolation. Which means that, at least on the face of it, if the way to have reduced isolation students is to recruit from outside of Hartford, the data on a school-by-school basis would tell us that that is a really challenging strategy to succeed with, as it's been played out in this district over the years. So just to be very specific about it, the graph on the right, which is 2017, page 31, shows you what are all the dots on that chart. So that suburban column is which really is non-Hartford residents, is the horizontal axis. The reduced isolation is the vertical axis. And you can see, even just eyeballing it, there's no significant relationship, anything, an inverse relationship between the proportion of kids who come from outside Hartford and the proportion of kids who qualify as reduced isolation. Yep. Yep. So right today, looking at the chart on the right, and this is just the underlying data for the chart on the right. So whether you eyeball it here or look at the trend line here on the right now, this year, small number of data points in terms of number of schools you have, but for the magnet schools in Hartford, the higher proportion of kids who come from outside Hartford, right now, the lower the proportion of students who qualify as reduced isolation, which is exactly the inverse of what the intent of recruiting students from outside Hartford is. Which tells us that students who, as we'll look at, students who are coming to HPS magnet schools from outside Hartford do not necessarily look the way the strategy implies they would look, quite literally. So when we look at the whole district trend over time, we can break this down pretty clearly, right? So there's 4 buckets of students we could look at, right? So it's sort of a 2 by 2. You live within Hartford or you live outside Hartford, you qualify as reduced isolation or you don't qualify as reduced isolation. So what you can see over time is that the proportion of kids, and this is across all Hartford magnet schools, has evolved, right? The dark blue line is the proportion of suburban residents, non-Hartford residents, who do not qualify as reduced isolation. That proportion has been increasing in our magnet schools. In return, the proportion of suburban students who are reduced isolation kids has been declining. So the shorthand for this, and again, I would defer to the attorneys on the specifics of it, but from our conversations, the shorthand for this is the proportion of non-Hartford residents who are Black or Latino has been increasing in our magnet schools. The proportion of non-Hartford resident students who are not Black or Latino, largely white or Asian American, has been declining. At the same time, there's been a marginal decrease in the proportion of Hartford resident students who are not reduced isolation, right? So Black and Latino Hartford resident students in our magnet schools. This has been coming down slightly over time. And it's only 1 percentage point, right, from 41 to 40. But you can see that difference. So the question is, why is that happening? So I can see the looks on your faces. And we're going to break this down into the different types of schools based on this data, because there are different situations in different schools, and to inform your conversation, we think it's important to understand what are the dynamics that are happening, at least from a data standpoint, within each type of school.
Excuse me a minute. Forgive me, I have a cough drop in my mouth. Given the fact that Hartford's 18.5 or 18 square miles, and we have a fiscal crisis, as you know, we're trying to create a long-term financial stability plan. And you might have to defer to one of our guests from the state with this, but I've always thought that 48, 46 schools was too many schools anyway. So what would be the magic number for how many schools we should settle on? Because again, being finance chair, we are running a deficit, and that deficit is going to increase. And so in the finance committee, we were talking maybe 25 schools total. So I'm just trying to figure out if we can come up with a magic number of how many schools that we can settle on. And if you know, or if anyone else in the audience from the state can chime in.
Are we taking bids?
Taking bids.
That is a difficult question to answer because there isn't a magic number, at least from where we sit at ERS. I can share a little bit of context that might inform that, right?
What about
from the state?
Can I ask Costa? Is that my
Well,
turn?
from a facility perspective, from a facility perspective, it would be maybe Costa, but David, I'm still interested in hearing what you.
Yeah. So if you're dealing in a world where you don't have existing facilities to manage, right, and you're solving for ensuring that your schools aren't so small as to be inefficient and require you to spend resources create constraints in how you spend resources, right? So small schools that are organized traditionally, one teacher, one classroom, have benefits, but they are more expensive to operate. And by expensive, that means your dollars are spoken for. There are certain things you must do to make that school run, which limits your flexibility to do other things, right? So one teacher, one classroom. There's 22 kids in the class instead of 25 kids in the class, or 20 instead of 25. At some point, those are dollars that I can't use for an interventionist, or for extended time, or for whatever other strategies I might want. So it's neither good nor bad, so much as an acknowledgement that that is an embedded strategic choice. That said, generally speaking, an elementary school that is below about 350 students, that's generally in most districts where the costs per pupil start to rise. A secondary school of about 500 kids, that's where the costs start to rise. And then the other wrinkle in this is a K-8 school of a similar size is generally more expensive on a per student basis, because you're spreading those students across more grade levels or more classrooms, which is sort of part of the genesis of the strategy. So in theory, absent the facilities you have and not thinking about any other needs of your students, you could say, great, we don't want an elementary school of less than 350, a secondary school of less than 500, and a K-8 school of less than 450 or 500, I would argue a little higher for that many grades. And you could do the math and say, well, how many of each of those schools do we want, and come up with a number. That's a little bit of pure theory, because you're dealing with real students with real needs and real facilities.
Thank you.
So from the facility perspective, you still want Costa?
Yes, please, if you can.
From a facility perspective, if.
For us, we look at it from a different perspective. First of all, I'd like to echo the remarks made, and certainly support the comments that are made just now. We look at the facilities from a perspective of capacity as well. You know, what are the number of students that some of the existing schools are that you're able to house in that particular school, because we recognize there's a scale of economies at some point where the school is too small and requiring more resources. We know for a fact that many of your schools are underutilized at this point as far, or are too small, and therefore based on the manner in which your schools are maintained based on student population makes it difficult for you to maximize those funds so that they can be better used for education rather than facility maintenance. And at the same time, we recognize the fact that you're not able to appropriately maintain your buildings because simply the resources don't exist, which of course create other problems and costs. So we look at it at a facility being at least at 85% capacity, 88% capacity, to that nature, understanding as well that you're going to have movement within a community like Hartford, and therefore we want to make sure there's space is there for that movement of a student population based on families coming in. And of course we look at it as if we're improving the educational components, the buildings, within a community, families look at that. Hopefully, families are moving in as well, and making use of those facilities that we believe to be safe, secure, and the type of facilities that we think will achieve excellence, which should be every single school that we have here in the state of Connecticut. So a use of the school buildings is critically important. And I'll just lay it out straight, because those of folks who know me know I'm pretty straightforward. For instance, a school like Buckley High School, which is supposed to be housing 2,500 students, functioning at 700 students or less, is impossible to support and expect to deliver the type of educational programming your superintendent and the community is looking for, knowing that you have such a large building with such a small population, and then somehow try to maintain it. So those are the things that we look at. Sure.
Well, I just wanted to maybe put a pin in it, because you said 85 to 88%, and I think, the slide we had talked about 82. I think what we were looking at in the model of excellence is getting us to 82%.
No
Well,
more than 87.
That's correct. Well, the superintendent, who is very, is trying to be very accommodating to the community, and so if we had our way, we would be pushing, closer to 90%. But there's a partnership here, and the partnership is we recognize we're looking to work with folks. So we've backed off of that number, and we're working with the superintendent and the district to move along in that regard. So capacity is important.
Madam Brody, Ms. Brody.
So we see a slide that everybody else didn't see that I can't take my eyes off. We see some of quite a few of our magnet schools that are operating more than 50% from the suburbs, and I'm trying to figure out how does that happen. So I don't know.
What
So-
slide number? Do you have it at the bottom?
I've seen this slide like before months ago, and when it shows us how the percentage of the suburban students,
I think it's the one
Slide 31.
31.
So
31.
31. Okay. Yeah, there you go. Yes, this is right.
So I'm trying to figure out how that happens. How do we ever get over 50% in a magnet school designed for Hartford kids, because we're in racial isolation, and you end up with, say, the last one, 64% coming from out of town. That's problematic.
I'll acknowledge. I'm acknowledging, right, that, we have work that we have to do internally, and certainly with our partners here. I know that, the state folks are here. I don't know if this is a conversation around, I guess I should preface by saying that this is, there have been conversations before, and trying to identify ways that we can maintain the integrity, if you will, of the standards. And so we continue as a district to try to work towards that. And so while I don't have the specific why, I do acknowledge that it is a challenge. And I know that that's some of the data that we have in front of us here today.
Well, it is problematic, I think, but instead of trying to, what we don't want to do is negotiate anything right here. What we want to do is figure out and ask questions, so we can have more information. So if any other state employee can help and chime in, please feel free to step up to the table, because what we need to understand is how we're going to create a balanced district, a balanced portfolio district.
While knowing that there are mandates, right, that we have to
Fulfill.
uphold.
I'll take the invitation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Good evening, members of the board, Superintendent, Vice Chair Glanville, and Chair Stallings. My name is Peter Haberlant. I'm the Director of Legal Affairs at the Connecticut State Department of Education. Superintendent earlier introduced my colleagues who are here with us tonight. We are certainly very encouraged that you all are having this discussion, that you're exploring these critical and challenging issues. Board Member Browdy asked the question, how did these percentages get that way? I don't know that we have the answer, but I can describe generally what the lottery process is and how it operates, and I think many board members are already familiar with that. I also want to say, right from the get-go, I think the state's goal in this system is to do everything we can do working collaboratively with you, with other critical stakeholders, with other magnet operators, including CREC and other operators, to increase the number of Hartford kids going to these magnet schools. That is a top priority of the state, and we, as the superintendent mentioned, we've been working together on that, and that's what we see as the path forward collaboratively, but it really does need to be a collaborative effort, and I want to emphasize that because I know earlier you were looking at some pros and cons of choices that may impact the magnets, and I just want to again use that word collaborative because a magnet school really is a commitment, a shared commitment to the families of Hartford by the state and the magnet operator together. So any critical decisions that have a significant impact on magnets really need to be made together, and there are laws and stuff about that as well that I know that you're aware of, and we can get into that as necessary, but just the big picture is collaboration and shared commitment. The lottery is a state-run lottery, but it critically depends on the participants who are the operators. The operators, Hartford, CREC, those operators who operate magnet schools, they declare seat availability every year. The lottery runs obviously based on who's applying for the schools, and that's how the lottery runs. These percentages, the high percentages of suburban students, our goal is to get things down. Ideally, it would be at least 50-50 or a higher number of Hartford students. That's actually a law for non-Board of Ed operated magnets. For the CREC magnets and for RESC operated magnets, the law requires 50-50. Even though there isn't a law that applies to the Hartford schools, it is our goal, like I said, to work moving forward to assist the operators in increasing the numbers of Hartford students in those schools. I'd be happy to address any other questions, and I have my colleagues with me here too.
I don't even know where to begin.
David, maybe you
Sure.
could put any other questions for now. Only because there are other slides that break up the data.
Yeah, we can
a
look
little
at
deeper.
this for different types of schools, because what's happening, at least what the data tells us is happening in different schools, is a little bit different from one to the next. And as you point out, Ms. Brody, certain schools are more suburban than others in terms of the proportion of students. And so what we've done on the following slides is try to show different groups of schools based on this data to try to suss out what's been happening and what that might imply for the district. And so we'll look at these in a few slides. The first group of schools, I think, are going to be schools that you're very familiar with. These are schools that are currently out of compliance and do recruit a relatively high, and in some cases increasing proportion of students, I should say, educate a relatively high and increasing proportion of students from outside of Hartford. What's been happening in these schools is a little bit of a challenging spiral, where basically you think about it, if you're not in compliance, you can do one of two things, right? You can try to increase the proportion of reduced isolation kids in the school, or you can actually reduce the denominator, reduce the number of seats available to that you stay in compliance with the number of reduced isolation kids that you have. And what's happening in these schools appears to, at least certainly in each case, is some combination of those things, right? So the proportion of kids coming from outside the city is higher, the proportion of reduced isolation kids is lower, and as a result of that, each of these schools is seeing a decline in enrollment overall and more seats open, right? So the utilization of the school is each of these schools is relatively low compared to some others. So these are the kinds of schools where you say, yep, a Hartford student might be on a wait list in a school in this situation because the school's been working to get more reduced isolation kids and not succeeding at it. And that's where you end up with empty seats and declining enrollment. Yeah. So the question here is about how can the district and the state figure out, is there a path for getting out of this spiral, right? And also what can we learn from these schools that might inform how we support and treat other schools that maybe aren't in this situation today, but are at risk of being here at some point. So these three schools that we'll look at all are recruiting right around 50% of students from outside of Hartford, and they're at the 25% compliance figure, give or take a little bit. The challenge here is all of these schools are pretty fully utilized. So there isn't a big opportunity to, right now with the current facilities, to increase the number of seats available for Hartford students, and we'll observe the proportion of students who reduced isolation has been declining and is hovering right around that 25%, right? So if you increase the number of seats available for Hartford students, assuming they're not reduced isolation, then somehow you have to reverse that trend even more so. But right now there aren't really seats in these schools for those students. There's a third set of schools that are in an interesting situation where the proportion of non-Hartford students they're educating has been increasing, and they are at or out of compliance. So these are some of the schools, Ms. Brody, I think you were alluding to earlier. And again, these schools are not, the utilization story varies a little bit. The schools are not growing. They've been trying, it appears from the data, schools have been trying to recruit more students from outside of Hartford to stay in compliance. So how does increasing that recruitment affect access and compliance for Hartford students? And then the last group of schools are schools that are in compliance. The trend varies from school to school, and appear to be relatively safely so, although you can't foreshadow what the trend is. And so then the question is, what opportunity do we have to increase access for Hartford students in these schools, right? Where the numerator of reduced isolation kids is high enough that you could increase the denominator of number of students. And in some of these schools, there appears to be open seats. In many, not so much, right? You have several schools here that are in the mid-90s, and with mobility around the district, you just, that's where you want to be thoughtful about where you actually have seats that you can sustain over time. The other piece that we wanted to highlight here was how this plays out across grade levels. So we've been looking at schools at all grade levels before. What we've done here is just say for all of the magnet schools, what is the proportion of reduced isolation students in each grade level in total? And as you can see, once you get above third grade and above, there's not a single grade level across the schools where, as a district, we're in compliance with Jeff. The measurement is happening school by school, obviously, but the average, right, across everyone is below. And the factor that is really bringing the total proportion of reduced isolation kids up is pre-K. And we've heard this story from several folks just in our conversations. This is the availability of free pre-K is as a parent, I could say, it's an incredibly attractive thing. And so as a family who's maybe living outside of Hartford, taking advantage of that, and then when my child moves into kindergarten or first grade, coming back to my local school. So I think we have to acknowledge that any effort to attract more or retain reduced isolation kids is to take into account the fact that such a large proportion of pre-K students right now are reduced isolation, and that is really bringing the average up. And in certain schools, and we can look at that here, in certain schools it's an even bigger factor. So you can see some schools here where the pre-K, the blue bar, the dark blue bar, is well over 25%, and the other bar is maybe all below 25%. Right? So the factor that is helping these schools stay in compliance is the reduced isolation kids in pre-K, and only in pre-K. I'm happy to keep moving. I know there's a lot of thinking going on, so I wanted to pause if there were.
Mrs. Glanville has a question.
Oh, no, yeah.
Or statement.
Or
I don't know.
statement, question? You have the floor.
I mean, I know that I've said this a lot, and I don't want to get off, but, you know, this is something that, I know that this came up, like, PREC is actually starting to charge preschool tuition. It was, you know, something that happened earlier this year, and it's something that we actually charge preschool tuition in our neighborhood schools. We charge families a sliding scale of tuition for preschool, and so, I mean, so when we're talking about resources, right, and you're looking, and I'm seeing, like, all of these kids that are in pre-K, is there an opportunity, you know, even just in that regard, you know, I'm seeing the, you know, I guess, reason why we're doing this, because it helps us be compliant, which then helps us get $13,000 ahead for every, you know, like, for every suburban student that's coming, but, you know, but you know, I have questions about how that's actually maintaining the integrity of the intent of the, you know, exercise of creating integrated schools when it's like only in the lower, like, not even in elementary school. So, but is there, I mean, is there opportunity around that from a resource perspective? At least, like, we are spending money to create these preschool classrooms. We charge, you know, tuition.
Yeah. So I think there's at least two angles to this that you're naming. One is the resource implications and one are the equity and access implications. And so to focus specifically on the resource implications, acknowledging that equity and access is crucial and central in all of this. And the question that we would be asking is, well, what is the revenue that you're getting from those students coming in to the district right now? And if you start charging for pre-K, do you put any of that revenue at risk? And does that limit what you can be doing with those dollars? That, to me, and picking up on the superintendent's point, I think and I think your point, Ms. Glenville, I don't know that, I think the central question is your equity and access question, which is, what does it mean that this is how we're managing it? Like, so I think the resource issue is important and central, but I would be cautious about that. And I don't think you're implying this to be the central thing. Yeah.
I see it as an equity access issue as
Yeah.
well. I mean, I've found it to be, like, very inequitable that we would charge preschool
Yes.
tuition to Hartford families in neighborhood schools and not charge it at all, right? Like in
Right.
magnet schools. So I think that's also an equity issue. And then looking at how we're utilizing pre-K to effectively to make our schools be compliant. But it's, I mean, is that like an integrated? I mean, like what, like, you know, is that really like an integrated experience then for like the kids in the middle school? You know, because it's attached to a pre-K.
Right.
Or the
Right.
school in
That has a
general.
Fair question.
bunch
Or a third grader.
of suburban
Yeah.
students in it, you know, and reduced isolation students in it. Like,
Yeah.
is that? I mean, if we have a whole school that all it is pre-K.
Right.
I think I should chime in.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
So-
see if you want to chime in.
Just one kind of note of thinking about this. Our understanding, and this is the first time thinking of it right now, but I just talked with a colleague, our understanding is that the current statutes don't authorize a Board of Education to charge tuition for pre-K students. That would be a conversation for you to explore, you know, with a legislative delegation to get a change.
we're not. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
We
just,
know that.
okay, just to put that
Yeah.
out there. Okay.
Oh, well, just for the record, we're going to have a lot of conversations about tuition and other things, so that's the reason why we're asking these
Got it.
questions.
Well, but I think
Makes sense.
I've certainly heard in response to that well, one of the reasons why we would be cautious to not charge tuition is because it could implicate the number of reduced isolation students we're getting, since we rely so heavily on our pre-Ks to be compliant.
Right.
As a reason not to charge tuition, like not even to consider charging tuition. I mean, this was actually some of the concerns about even correct charging tuition now that they're starting to charge it, was because it's going to like potentially impact the amount of, you know, reduced isolation students we can get, since we all rely so heavily, clearly, on pre-K for compliance, which is like, as you said, another issue.
Right, and those are critical policy discussions that it makes very good sense that you're having. I would just point out that you could have that even if you had the legal authority to do it. We don't think you do have that legal authority right now.
No.
I mean, for example, CREC, I think, had the authority and didn't do it until very recently. So that's really to the point you're making, but
Yeah.
understand.
So, but moreover to that point, let's talk about what's right. So when you have you reduce isolation students and we're compliant because we're filling pre-K, but then when you look at the middle school experience or the high school experience and we're not compliant, are we really doing what's best for our children? And so the ultimate question that we have is what's right for our children, how we provide a quality education for all of our children, whether in the neighborhood schools or magnet schools, and how we begin to make sure that our integration goals or our integration requirement and standards don't get in the way of quality and delivering quality education to every student in the city. So that's the reason why we ask these questions.
Right, absolutely.
Because I want to charge for tuition. I want to charge the suburban tuition a little more. I mean, suburban students a little more tuition. So we have these kind of questions.
Sure.
And it's helpful for you to shoot them down so we can stop wasting time if it's not.
No, and I'm not shooting it down. I'm just
Well, you know.
trying to give you one avenue that you need to pursue to explore that. And you know, as with everything else, the State Department of Education stands ready to partner with you on brainstorming and how to tackle these issues.
Yes.
I don't know if it's for the superintendent or David, but do we know why compliance drops off after second grade?
I think we can, you know, when we talk about engaging in the conversations with each specific school around their context, is it a theme? I think there's an array of reasons why, and you know, we think about the experience that families are having, but as it relates to this specific point, we know that, you know, it's certainly after pre-K, and then, you know, we have the 5th grade, which is, you know, David has, if you can go back to that slide, right, that's the drop-off point.
I understand the pre-K, but I guess what I'm wondering is, are people becoming disappointed with the school? Is that why after second grade they move?
I don't have the answer as to one specific data point. I think we can certainly look at you know, the exit surveys and things like that for the trends.
Just from a pure data standpoint, I don't know if I would read too much into a single grade drop so much as the trend line is slightly down. Yeah,
after that.
the trend line is down.
If I can just make...
It's not necessarily suburban.
Right, and maybe, I know it's not my role to ask questions, but I just observe, I'd be cautious also to infer too much from aggregate data. I think what the superintendent says, and I know other board members echoed this, is that you really do need to drill in to individual schools. For example, I don't read that chart as saying that there's no school among the Hartford-operated magnets that has over 25% reduced isolation in 5th grade. I think that's am I right about that?
Yeah, I mean, you can see it here. The schools are in very different situations, right? If you just want to look at even the turquoise bar is grades 2 through 6 brought together.
So that's a turquoise.
That's the turquoise, right? The third one in each set. We don't have a visible 25% line across here, but you can sort of eyeball it and see. And you have several schools that even for grades 2 through 6 are at or over the 25% line for reduced isolation kids, and some schools that are below. So it really is going to vary school by school once you get beyond that pre-K question. Even the pre-K drop-off varies pretty significantly from one school to another.
Can I just have a clarification when you said it, that with these drop-offs, do we have separate data around the suburban? I mean, I know that it's reduced isolation drop-offs, but these schools are still showing, is that like across the grades as well, that they're like the suburban percentage, like, you know how you have the page where you broke it down, suburban?
Yeah, I would want to look at it.
Is that kind of?
I would want to go back and look grade by grade, but we know that over the years, the proportion of kids in magnet schools in aggregate that are Hartford students who qualify as reduced isolation has been about 4% of all students. So even if that number is fluctuating, a couple points, it's still going to be a pretty small minority of all your reduced isolation kids. But we can certainly look more deeply at that if that will change the story.
And that could be part of, the next level of work, Julio, to get at school-specific rationales and those elements that impact, which I think also gets to your question earlier, Ms. Brody.
Yeah, I don't think that it's, at least from a parent perspective, I've been in conversations with parents over the years, and we know free pre-K is attractive. That is not rocket science. They come for free pre-K. Yeah. And then they can make a decision. I can now go back to my neighborhood school. And if you're in these magnet schools, you see principals deal with the upcoming kindergartners in a different kind of way because they want those families to stay. So it's a lot of coddling. I guess that's a good question, because they want them to stay because they know pre-K 3, pre-K 4, they are there. Kindergarten, they actually stick around kindergarten. When you get to the first grade, they're gone. And that's not a secret, it's a fact.
Yep, all right.
So I think what we're, when we saw this data, and to your point, Ms. Brody, these are sort of, we just presume is consequences that maybe weren't projected off of the way the compliance work has happened and the strategy of schools in the district so far. And so the question that the data hopefully informs is, what does that imply for district and state conversations about how you move forward, and how do you use this opportunity with the district model for excellence to be a catalyst for that? Because I think you're right in identifying. I mean, I have to tell you you're right. But clearly, we just look at the data from the outside. There's seriously some unintended consequences that are happening here. That is not what the system was designed.
You want them to come, and you know they'll come when they're small. So that's a strategy. But they come and they're not staying. Yeah. So it's like you're doing a good thing with saying come when they're young, and it's attractive, it's a good opportunity. But when they get there, you're worried, like, are they going to stay? Are they not?
The last point I wanted to mention and leave you with to shape this conversation is, obviously reduced isolation is focused on the racial and ethnic background of students, and that is core to everything that is in this conversation. One thing we also looked at was the economic diversity of students. And so what you're looking at here is just students who come from outside Hartford and attend Hartford magnet schools. And we said, of those students, who qualifies for free reduced lunch, which is our proxy of low income, who is reduced isolation, and vice versa for both. And just as a point of reference, across the United States of America, about 50% of kids now qualify for free or reduced lunch. In urban centers, obviously, it's much, much higher, and in many rural areas, it's much, much higher. So just use that as a benchmark here. So of the students that HPS brings in from outside Hartford to magnet schools, looking at the vertical, 42% of those students are reduced isolation kids, which makes sense with everything else that we've seen before. However, more than half the kids, 53%, do not qualify for free or reduced lunch, right? So if another measure of diversity were, and we are not proposing this in any way as a proxy, but we want to acknowledge that the students the district is serving from outside of Hartford, many of the students who are not reduced isolation kids, right, who are Black or Latino kids presumably, do not qualify for free or reduced lunch, are in economically stable middle class situations. To the point where if you just look at the column on the left, right, 24 out of that 58, about 40%, 4 out of every 10 students who come from the suburbs that are not reduced isolation kids, right, Black or Latino kids, are coming from middle class families, basically, is a proxy for that. So what we want to acknowledge here is that the economic diversity of students coming in by these measures, the economic diversity of students coming in from suburban communities to Hartford Public School magnet schools is greater than the reduced isolation or racial ethnic diversity as it's currently measured here. That is not to say that it should be a proxy or replace anything or anything like that, but we want to acknowledge try to build our understanding of who are the students that are coming to Hartford Public Schools from outside the community. This profile of students may or may not match what individual folks' expectations are for it, but we found it to be really enlightening to build our understanding and get past the sort of headline versions of who's a suburban student, who's a Hartford student.
Ms. Taylor?
Yes. I think we talked about this before, but I can't remember what the answer was. So for a Hartford Public Magnet School that does not actually take free and reduced lunch applications and like all the students are given free and reduced lunch, like how is this factored into the data that we're seeing?
Yes, so for that reason, free reduced lunch data since 2015 is not reliable, so this is 2015 data that we're using.
2015?
15,
Okay.
correct.
I think you told me this before.
I didn't. Thank you for
did.
asking.
Okay, good.
I'm actually looking to see if our, where is she? Wait.
She's waving at you.
Oh, waving at me. Okay, in the back. Just wondering if you had yeah, just thinking through how we
If
can
you
get
don't
at
mind.
that data
Thank you so much.
in a different way.
I mean, I don't know that this is a critical sticking point, but I'm just curious in terms of like what we're seeing as we're trying to paint the picture on who's actually in the district.
Yeah, so this is
For
Lonnie.
homeschool communities that don't take the data.
Lonnie
Lonnie
Burr,
Burr.
but Lonnie, you were talking to me about other specific data that we do collect.
If you can just, for the record, introduce yourself and your title. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. My name is Lonnie Burton. I'm the Senior Director for Food and Child Nutrition Services here in the district. And so why we are not collecting free and reduced meal applications in this district is we were able to qualify our programs for something called community eligibility. And that data is based upon the number of students that are identified as a food stamp recipient or somebody living in a food stamp household. And we did hundreds of hours worth of work, Charlene Russell Tucker, I will just say to you, to gather that data. And how that data is collected is we do get a electronic file from the State Department of Education on a weekly basis that they get from the Department of Social Services, and they tweak to match up with the student, the SACID, the state SACID ID number. So we use the SACID ID number, we use their date of birth, and we use the student name to look at and to match them in our system. And so it is very true that when you look at the magnet schools, that those numbers decrease significantly. And so our lowest, and the last time we did this of April of 2016. It's a 4-year cycle. We look at it every year, and at this point, our percentage of students who are qualifying for either a food stamp or an extended eligibility or homeless, there are a couple other qualifiers, we are at 60.5%. You use a multiplier of 1.6 because we aren't collecting any applications, and so that multiplier of 1.6 takes into consideration families that would still qualify for free meals but might not be qualifying for food stamps, and then the reduced income households that are not part of the qualifiers. So when you look at that, taking the 1.6 multiplier by the 60.5, district-wide, right now, we are using a 96.79% free and reduced. So the data from, but when you look at it individual schools, that ranges from 89, 90% matched, not even using the qualifier, down to about 21% is one of our lowest schools, which is the University of Hartford Magnet School.
Which one, sorry?
University, U of H.
University High?
They're the lowest, I believe, yeah, at 22.75%. So it's a wide range. I'm very confident that these numbers are pretty accurate. We did a lot of work, a lot of manual work, a lot of looking at it. So I think that this is good data to look at in regards to where do your schools fall. But I don't see, I've been here since we were Provision 2. I've been here when we had to collect all the free and reduced meal applications, and so I see this has been very consistent across the years. Consistently, I see these same numbers. So when we came up with this CEP data, it did not surprise me. But that's how we're getting it, and every week we get the file, we still look at it. I did a lot of manual work to get these numbers, so if I were to pull that data today, it'd be a little bit lower at about 52, 53%, because I haven't done all the manual work because we're in a cycle. But when you do the manual, when you look at every individual student, and we took out and sorted and looked and searched for every single student name, I'm very confident this is good data for us to look at.
So that's every student in our district, not every Hartford student?
That's every student in our district. We get
regardless of where
regardless of where they live.
Great.
And so we get the file based upon who is registered in a Hartford Public Schools, whether it's a magnet school or a community neighborhood school. It doesn't matter what their address is, it's directed based upon. And since we used that state SACID ID number as one of the qualifiers, the matching qualifiers, I feel it was a really good one. We used that and switched to that. We captured another 3,000 names just doing that alone. So it's good data. And yes, it doesn't matter where you go. And then what we did was we sorted students that matched and did not match. And we have the ability in that state system. We have a fabulous identification system and a system to find these students. We are able to do an individual search for every student name that we had not matched, and we matched another, between that and extending the benefits, another 1,500 names. So we really have captured who should be on this list. We've captured.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question. So how does this affect the students from Puerto Rico? How do you count
Students in Puerto Rico, well, first of all, regardless of when you come in, we're in a CEP school. It's a universal feeding program, so we do not worry about what your income is or what your income is not. We don't ask that. We just feed everybody at no cost. And I don't use the word free because there's a different connotation. So we serve every student at all of our schools in Hartford a meal, breakfast and lunch, and if they have a supper program, at no cost. The only two schools, we have an inter-school agreement with Jamoki, and we have an inter-school agreement with the Crack Montessori program, and they are not part of this data because their numbers were not high enough. They were going to drag down our percentages. Our funding for the program, for the meal program, is based upon these percentages, and it was very important to us to get that to try and be up. We're in a 4-year cycle. It will end, this started in the 16-17 school year. This is the second year of that 4-year cycle. You can requalify any year in that 4-year cycle and restart a new cycle. We are in the process of really looking at that data. I will start to sort it out in the next couple of weeks because we're going to need to look at it for April 1st. But in regards to your question, those Puerto Rican students, or Puerto Rico, or wherever they come from, whatever island they come from, when they come here with the McKinney-Vento Act, I can never remember it all, they are considered a homeless student, and they will actually, and unfortunately, their misfortune is going to be our fortune because we will be able to qualify them as a homeless student, and it will help get our numbers up. And we're always looking to get this percentage because it helps with the funding. And I'm hoping that if we can extend it to Jamoki and to Crack, we would, but at the very moment, that's just not on the table. But all of those students we're matching, and we're getting that list. Marta Bentham and the Welcome Center are sending us those lists of students also as soon as they're registering them. We're getting those students and marking them as a homeless student in our system. So I can't say that it's not helpful, but right now it doesn't matter where you come from. If you are registered as a Hartford Public School student, you will get a meal at no cost with us.
Excellent. Yeah, I guess I ask my follow-up question. And this is probably to the state. Keeping along the lines of the students from Puerto Rico, is there a possibility of extra funds attached to those students as well? I understand that they've come, and some may into the lottery, but are we going to get additional funds per those students as well? Or are we simply just absorbing that cost? Any?
Federal funds will come, but we don't have state funds to support that.
Oh. Thank you.
Could you repeat her answer?
At this point, no state funding. We, because if you're expecting, we're expecting. Just want to say it. Federal funds are expected, but there's no update on that. Right?
Or date in sight. Okay. Any other questions?
No, this is the last analysis we have before we pass it back for conversation. So thank you for the opportunity. And if there are further questions, happy to answer them.
No, not yet.
You know where to find us.
Yeah, no, wait, David, not yet, but did you get your, general, okay.
Yeah, just ask a question.
Did you get your question answered from facility question, because you?
Actually, I did not, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Casa. You said it was hard to come up with a number, but what we're trying to figure out is, from a fiscal standpoint, from a financial standpoint, what we can afford and what we can't afford. And thinking about deficits and growing deficits. For example, just off the top of my head, I'm going to pull, we're running a $12 million deficit thus far. And so some of the savings, I'm speculating, some of these savings, we stand to potentially save or mitigate $15 million over 4 years. We also can assume that some of that money is going to be eaten up into our deficit costs. And so how do we create the balance? And so what I'm really asking is, and I'll use a 25 number again, if we reduce our total district to 25 schools, would that be a sustainable model where we can then deal with our deficit and still provide quality resources to every school and maintain compliance with CHEF? Or if we have 36 schools that we're potentially thinking about right now, would that be enough to now afford us the ability to provide quality education, maintain our facilities, and do what we need to do?
All right, let's see. Let's look at it from our perspective, the Office of School Construction Grants at DAS. One of the things that we do is we look at the total amount of square footage you have in your district for building space, for students, for academic space. Once we take that into account, we look at the total number of students you have in your district, and then we look at the various requirements that Hartford has, and I say that Hartford has because the consequences of CHEF and all of the other mandates that come through the district that we're trying to deal with affect Hartford. So from a school construction perspective, we look at how many buildings do we need to effectively utilize so that we can provide a safe environment, an academically adequate environment, and one that provides the same education to a neighborhood child that in a very fancy theme-oriented school, okay? So the idea for us is we don't care what the academic program is. What we care about is the suitability of the building to be equitable and adequate across the board to provide the particular academic program that is needed, that we need to provide. We think that you're somewheres around 35% too big as far as buildings are concerned. Now, that could very well mean our estimate at the Office of School Construction right now off the top of our head is maybe 10 buildings. So you might be 10 schools too big. 7 we could work with at this point in time to move forward, having had some discussions, collaborative discussions going on, but that's minimum is 7. So we can be there. Now, what that translates to as far as dollars and operating costs, I think is significant. And of course, that takes us to a certain point, and the more we start working through some of the other high schools and some of the types of collaborative programs, very similar to what's going on in Weaver or some of the work we're trying to do at Martin Luther King. The other thing we do is we look at the buildings and which ones we think are buildings that are prime candidates to renovate. Because we may want a building, but you may not get that building because it simply does not make financial sense for the state to invest those kinds of dollars to renovate a particular building that isn't really suitable at that point in time. And based on the academic plan, it may be necessary for us to build a school that otherwise is not suitable now to be a school. So that'll come about as this plan continues to be developed and formalized so that we can partner with you to say, here's the school buildings we think that we can viably maintain, renovate, and invest in to accommodate everyone's needs, whether it's a CHEF magnet need, a Hartford magnet need, or a neighborhood need. And then here are the buildings that simply cannot work for us. And that decision is made. I've taken the time to visit as many schools as I possibly can to this point. I'm not done, right? Lord knows there's plenty of schools to visit. So when we're completed with that, we will have our own recommendations to you of which buildings we think we can work with. and maybe need to build again. The other thing to take in consideration is it may be a school you need to close that is very viable from the community's perspective, from the town side, that is marketable for another purpose. Although that may, so that has economic viability, of course, to you as well. So, and of course, as we're looking at the schools, and ones that we can't use and are far gone, demolition becomes a part of it. And from our perspective at school construction, we see that as being part of the construction process in which we would like to demolish buildings. What we don't want to do in neighborhoods is allow buildings to become places for crime and so on and so forth. So if we're going to go to the point of closing down a building that doesn't have another future use, I'd rather see it down at the ground leveled and make that piece of land viable for another purpose, rather than creating another problem within a particular area. So there's a lot of pieces to it. But the short answer to your question is at least 7 buildings. I think you're 7 too fat. And my goal would have probably been 10. But again, your superintendent is very persuasive based on the type of plan sometimes she likes to do, as is the board members that we've talked to. So, but 7 is the minimum. 7 got to go.
Thank you. That's actually helpful, and I look forward to the School Choice Facilities Committee's report on that. So, thank you so much. Ms. Glanville.
So I think this is a question for you, David. So it seems like in some of these slides that we're limited in some of our magnet schools from growing the enrollment, or even potentially from serving like the ideal number of students based on the model of equity. Because of, I mean, I do have different kind of baskets of schools, but at least in a couple of them because of the lack of reduced isolation compliance. And so, like, I guess my question is, so how, but we know at the same time, like, we're still, even if it might be really like on paper, it's, you know, not not aligned with our model, right, to operate a very small middle grades of a magnet school, because we're saying we want to have middle grades that are more robust and that are more, you know, like have maybe twice as many kids in some instances. But we know that we get $60 million of our budget around that in magnet operating grant, which is pretty much the number of suburban students in the district divided by 13,000, because that's what we get for each of the students. So, you know, that's a lot of students still, even if it's like not really complying with our model, it's a lot of students in these schools that are suburban that are giving us a lot of resources as a district. But, you know, I also am hearing this theme throughout the parent feedback in this whole process about we want to do things that make sense. We want to do things that make sense. And so I'm struggling with, like, well, it doesn't seem like it makes sense in the model of excellence that we're saying to operate a magnet school that's declining in enrollment because of, you know, compliance reasons, or, you know, helped illuminate some of the reasons why that may be the case of particular magnet schools. Or that, you know, has a very, very small middle school when we've just said that doesn't really work for all of these reasons. But, like, but it makes sense still to get the money from, you know, significant number, even if it is a smaller number than, say, another school, but a significant number of suburban students at $13,000 a student into our budget in these times of strapped resources. So, like, what, and I'm not asking you to, like, I know that you don't know, like, the whole way forward, but, like, that's what I'm struggling with in terms of, like, what makes sense. Like, there's different kinds of sense, and I think we're all trying to talk about equity, but that's just not an insignificant number.
Yeah, so I think
$60 million.
Yeah, so the thing we talk about at ERS a lot is, and I'm sure my colleagues will laugh at me for this. You can do anything, but you can't do everything, right? So what you've identified, Ms. Glanville, I think, is appropriately saying, look, we've made a series of choices here so that we can bring the revenue in and create this model, and it comes with a sort of an equity implication, and the trade-off of solving that equity implication is, well, what if people signed up to be in the K-8 school and they don't want to, you know, the 5th to 6th grade transition creates an opportunity for people to move their kids out of the district, right, whether to charter or to going outside going back to a neighboring community. And so what are the trade-offs associated with that? So I think you've identified and been a leader in identifying what those issues are, and I think that's one of the reasons why this is, just such a challenging conversation for Hartford Public Schools in particular, because there's another consequence of this particular model is that the volume of dollars that are on the table that you're thinking about. I think, and I would defer to the superintendent on this, but one of the driving underlying factors in the fact that the main move in the district model for excellence so far has been co-location of magnets in neighborhoods and not reconfiguring the grades. This has been one reason why, is that you're taking on a risk that is different there, and I think that sort of is part of the genesis of these conversations, is that a risk that you want to take on, and what are the benefits associated with it? That's a long way of validating, hopefully, your point, but I think you're right to identify the challenge.
Thank you. I appreciate you letting me I wanted to give you a further complete answer because we talked about the number of buildings. But one of the other things that we're looking at is also leaseholds within communities, things along those lines. So based on the amount of space that exists within various school buildings, we'd like to see a diminishing amount of use of leasehold. As you know, the state is also doing similar in nature, reducing the amount of square footage that we have in leaseholds, because those monies are probably better spent within the school districts. And the other thing that we're looking to do is Board of Eds occupying spaces within their schools, because we've noticed that a lot of the districts have spaces, square footage, that's unused or underutilized, in which Board of Eds can accommodate. And we recognize the fact that there are some districts that are very large, like your own, that in fact you would need a very large footprint as a result, not necessarily for the bodies, which can fit into the building, but parking, which in some communities become a premium. That would require the Board of Ed itself to maybe divide up into different departments, so to speak, for lack of a better word, and however that would be, so that you may occupy the Board of Ed, different divisions may be in different parts of the community and spread out. We also see, based on some of the studies that we've reviewed, the state of Connecticut is also part of the National Council of School Facilities. We also read a great deal of the studies coming out of the 21st Century Fund, and we see that the more spread out we seem to be and involved in the school districts in various parts of the community, the more community involvement there is. There's a safe, secure feeling, there's a sense of caring, and the districts seem to grow better in that respect. So those are the other things as we're looking at how do we compress the district. It's also the leaseholds and where the Board of Eds are located. And finally, one of our other important things is less incubation and more implementation. So wherever these programs are incubating, and they may be small, and get used to being in that place for what was supposed to be temporary space has become long-term space, which becomes a drain on the resources within that community as well. So the other things that we're looking at is how many programs are being incubated that should have gone a long time ago and are still there that need to move into a bigger space or a more adequate space to grow the program, as well as maximize the use of the various buildings that we're investing in. Hopefully that, I just wanted to complete that answer.
Naturally, that was very, very extremely helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity to share. I'm going to do our little dance of passing this back, and happy to answer more questions as they come up.
Thank you so much.
Do I get to ask my question? Oh, I don't know if it might not be for you, David. It might be for you. You can't leave. Peter?
Yeah, I would just sit there. The state will probably come in and out.
He's got a
y'all
whole
want
sheet of
this
paper
back?
over here that he's been starting on. Anyway, so I had a couple of questions. I wanted to go back to Shantae's question about the percentage of Hartford students in Hartford Public Magnet Schools. And I was wondering, like, is there a mandate, like the other providers have, for us to maintain a certain percentage of Hartford residents within our magnet schools, considering that the Chef ruling was to reduce racial and economic isolation for Hartford students, particularly North Enders?
Right, so what I think I referred to earlier was a statute passed by the legislature concerning RESC-operated magnets in the Chef region. So that statute provides a 50-50 rule, but you asked about a mandate which could come, not necessarily from a statute, just a commitment. And I think what I said earlier is really the state sees it as an absolutely pivotal goal, which we think Hartford shares or should share, which is to together work to get that percentage up, the percentage of Hartford students in Hartford magnets. And that's one of our goals. But you were asking, is there a mandate? There isn't something in current law that's comparable to the law that applies to RESCs. But that doesn't mean Hartford can't do it. In fact, we would certainly welcome and encourage and want to work with Hartford to achieve that, increasing that percentage. Yeah.
Robin, can you, only so that when we record it, we can hear it. Well, we can hear you, but I don't know that the mic is gonna take it in. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, there isn't a statutory mandate relative to Hartford's percentages, suburban versus Hartford students, but in the Commissioner's new reduced isolation standard, which was issued this year, pursuant to statute, the language in that standard requires Hartford to increase the number of Hartford resident minority students in Hartford magnet schools where there is the percentage of reduced isolation kids in that school is much higher than the 25% standard. So that's a directive from the Commissioner to work with Hartford on increasing the number of Hartford students in the schools in those situations.
I mean, just looking at the data that ERS has articulated for us, it seems as though we have lots of Black and Latino students coming into Hartford from the suburbs, which, I mean, we appreciate the economic diversity, assuming there's economic diversity there. But it just seems that so many of our students are looking to have access to these programs that are right inside of their city. And I'm just wondering, like, if it is within our wheelhouse to do it, I think that we definitely should. But we have the power to do it. Hartford Public Schools.
Oh, absolutely, and that's something we have already discussed with Hartford and been working with Hartford on increasing the number of Hartford students in those schools where the percentage of reduced isolation students is relatively high as compared to the 25% standard that's currently in effect.
So, just to, and exactly as Robin said, the baseline assumption is we all need to be achieving compliance at the same time as we're achieving more seats for Hartford kids. So when you say, does the Hartford Board of Education have that power? Together, working together, we can together do that. But we certainly need to make sure we're also meeting the demands of the constitutional mandate applicable to this region to desegregate the schools. So we both want to have compliance and more Hartford kids in the schools. And that's the goal that we need to figure out really on a school-by-school basis.
So is the disproportionate amount of suburban students of color because of the lottery process, or is it something that I'm missing?
If you're asking about the disproportionate number of minority students in the schools?
Well, students of color from the suburbs. Students
of color in the suburbs. Well, that's a really interesting question, and I think, I would speculate that all the parties involved in the Chef case and in the region who are thinking about these issues are researching that and trying to figure out. One likely reason that's emerged in a lot of conversations is just, quite frankly, the change in demographics of the region, the changing demographics of the suburbs. But one of the things that's challenging about this is you really do need to drill into data and analyze, and that's why I really welcome and appreciate the board's careful attention to this. It's hard to draw easy, broad stroke conclusions about a phenomenon like this. But Robin, if you have anything to add.
Well, I'll just add that in terms of just generally the percentages of suburban students in both Hartford and Craig and Goodwin operated magnets and others, in some schools you'll see a higher percentage of suburban as compared to Hartford students, and that's sort of a nature of this big issue we've been talking about, is meeting the constitutional mandate, which is now currently set at 25% reduced isolation. So there are circumstances with schools where the school's forced to enroll more suburban students to get to that constitutional mandate as currently set. So that's kind of the balance that becomes difficult at times.
Thank you. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, there's nowhere that written, no law, no statute that says 50% of the Hartford magnet schools should be occupied by Hartford students. That's just something we say is a good number, but we're not held to that number. Is that correct?
Well, there's nowhere in statute that says that with regard to RESC-operated magnets either. The statute as written requires the RESC-operated magnets to bring in 50% incoming students that are Hartford resident students. So it's not, the idea is to get to at least 50% overall in the school, but this is something that's happening over time. On the Hartford side, there is nothing comparable in statute, but in this new standard that was issued by the commissioner this year, it specifically states that the expectation is that Hartford will increase its enrollment of Hartford students in those schools where there's sufficient reduced isolation students to allow that and still meet the mandate. And that's a collaborative process that we expect to go through as we move through the lottery process. So is there a statute? No, but there's a directive.
Okay, because we seen on one of the slides where the schools, even the schools that had more of the suburban students,
yeah,
they're still, like you're trying to get more suburban students hoping you're going to get that 25%, and it's just not happening. So while that is increasing, the number of the 25% is not, they're not making a mark. So I understand the principal saying, well, we want to accept more suburban students because we may get more Asian and Caucasian students, but it's just not happening. So we've tried that, and it's just not working. But it's definitely disheartening for a parent who's trying to get one of those seats, and they looking at that chart saying, I just can't get into a school that I want for whatever reason. And it's more kids from out of town benefiting from something that was even brought about because of what Hartford wasn't getting. So it's definitely disheartening to families. So I'm hoping we'll trying to reverse that and getting Hartford families to get more opportunities.
Ms. Glanville?
I just had a question about, should we anticipate as a result of that a decrease in our magnet operating grant then? Because I just, I always kind of look at this whole magnet operating grant as a number, but, assuming that, and I know, at least we've talked about this in the Facilities and Choice Committee about how I think last year we had less suburban seats left on the table, but in years past we've had up to 200 suburban seats that would have been funded, but were left on the table because of compliance reasons, and we've managed to bring that down. But then if we're going to talk about filling some of our more compliant, high reduced isolation schools with more Hartford students, but we don't have room to do that in other schools, and we're not seeing an overall increase in suburban enrollment. I know that this isn't a negotiation, but I'm just is that going to impact our our total magnet operating?
Well, if you do that in isolation, absolutely, because if you increase your Hartford population and decrease your suburban population, you only get paid for the suburban population. But I don't think the idea is to do that in isolation. It's to address make these tough choices with regard to, we have, I think someone said buckets of schools. There's buckets of schools. And those schools that have high percentage reduced isolation students, we need to have more access for Hartford kids. In the schools where we're having years of struggle in terms of meeting the mandate, then there has to be some difficult decisions made on how to restructure those programs in order to get to that perfect balance. And right now, the quandary is we keep adding suburban kids and we're not improving in compliance. So something does have to change. You can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. and think it's just going to get better. So I think that we know with a handful of schools that some difficult decisions have to be made and what changes need to be instituted so that we don't continue this problem and limit access in schools that have seats that are available.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can I just note that
Sure.
when we were looking at those schools that didn't have that issue of making that 25%, they were Montessori, they were STEMs and science-based schools. That they have no problems hands
Do you
down.
mind going
So
back? You have the
Sure.
clicker there,
Sure.
slide, or slide 31.
And that actually
Thank
tees up a question for me when Ms. Brody's done. Oh. So,
There was another one that
Which
had the
one?
graphs. Baskets of schools.
so while they're doing that, we also math and science in our district is something that we are trying to build more capacity and build curriculum with. How do we? Are there strategies that we can provide more STEM programs throughout the district to make our school more attractive, to reduce isolation of students and things of that nature? Are there other strategies that we have not discussed? I know you're currently discussing things, and I'm not asking you to divulge that. But are there alternative ways that we can possibly meet compliance, either through other programs, after-school programs, sports, or anything else that we can do?
Right. Well, I think you're asking exactly the right questions, which would be part of a process of collaboration that Robin alluded to just a moment ago, which is when the state and the magnet operator engage in a process, a dialogue, and it takes some time to really drill in to what's happening at a school, what's happened in the past at the school. Some of the schools that are being looked at, have had periods of compliance in the past, like for example, Classical Magnet. But that's kind of a diagnostic process. It's discussions, it's listening to key stakeholders, trying to figure out part of that process that we think will be really useful now and enlivened with new information is we have put on this year's lottery application forms some survey questions about exactly these questions. What themes are attractive? Are you looking for new themes? That kind of stuff. Trying to get at information that can really inform brainstorming. It really does need to be school specific. So I think, Mr. Chairman, the answer is we don't necessarily have the answers right now, but we know that those conversations can happen and they can really be fruitful and productive. We've actually done it before. I can turn again to Robin, who can give some examples of schools where the state and Hartford have collaborated to redesign schools in the chef system. It's not a new thing. It's something that we can do. Do you want to comment on those?
Yeah, there have been a number of examples in the past where we have had schools that have difficulty meeting the compliance standard and have gone through a significant renovation in order to come back and be more attractive to students in the suburban community. So two good examples that people are probably familiar with are Annie Fisher and Mary Hooker. Both of those schools closed down as magnets for a period of time. School building, construction projects were associated with both, and retheming. And those, if you look at that chart, which we don't have up anymore, but, oh, it's here. Both of those schools have significant numbers of reduced isolation students in those schools, and those are opportunities to increase Hartford students in those schools because of that. But like, for example, Annie Fisher, because of Montessori, we added the Montessori theme to that school, and then there's a STEM theme. So that school has both of those themes that you've mentioned. It's very attractive. Mary Hooker was more of just a science, and now it's more of an environmental STEM school. So that can be very effective with a little break, and then moving forward aggressively can be very successful and benefit both Hartford students and students in the suburban communities.
And I just want to follow up on that and say that really to the point that the chairman was making before, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Experience shows us that. It's not always going to be that there's one answer that's going to address things. You got to think outside the box, and I think the board seems poised to do that, and we encourage that, and we are too, with the goals in mind that we've already been talking about.
Okay.
So, in that, I guess I have two questions. One of them is about open choice, and the other one is about like sort of innovative alternative models for integration and like what we've been doing with just the standard lottery-based system. Like, so I think the slide got at this, but with the open choice, we already have a couple schools that are open choice, but the reason I think why we don't promote that as a inter-district regional strategy as much as magnet schools is because it's less per pupil funding for the suburban students for open choice. And so that's one thing that I wonder, like, is there any sort of like hybrid situation where we can look at that kind of a situation for, and I know you're talking about maybe taking a break or redesigning, but like as among these alternatives, because that was one of those alternatives that was presented in the list of options. And then one of the other ones that was presented was this idea of like, making a school a neighborhood school again. And I just wonder, like, are there instances where that, I mean, it doesn't financially make sense, right? Like, given how much money we're getting for it, but in the make sense kind of, approach, like, are there schools where it would make sense for them to be like a neighborhood school and a magnet school at the same time? Like, I think like I've heard it called a hybrid magnet, or like a magnet that has like a catchment area or something like that. Is that something that we could talk about in terms of like, just that's not like a model for that, like in the RESCO schools as currently, they are, but like the idea of some, models that would also help with community economic development, Hartford neighborhoods, stabilizing our neighborhoods, allowing neighborhood students like access, some of the themes that we're seeing in the model for excellence, and even just in the city, in terms of looking at innovative strategies for some of these schools too. And again, it's for sure it's not a one size fits all for like each one of these schools in the baskets, but I'd really like to see that discussed more as something we can do. And it's hard when you're just always kind of looking at this per pupil funding model with the 13,000. Like I just think I'd be curious like what other options there are around. Maybe is it a different funding per pupil funding model? Is it like we had the Lighthouse School for a while where we got like lump sum grant funding? It was like, over 3 years, X amount, like that kind of funding stream.
Well, to answer your first question with open choice, I've actually had conversations with the superintendent about being strategic about open choice opportunities and increasing those options for Hartford to bring in more kids, because I think that is one way to have a school operating and bringing in students from the suburbs and bringing in a flow of operating grant that increases with your percentage of students coming in. So right now it's at 3,000, but it goes up to 8. So there is opportunity to provide a pretty significant amount of money per student, but that has to be strategic. Up to this point, it really hasn't been. It has to be an opportunity to reduce isolation. So that has to be looked at in terms of what schools those opportunities are going to be in and how to be more strategic about marketing it. 2 schools that did do that were Baton to STEM and Baton to CRL. Those we used through the open choice program initially and merged them into magnet schools because they were having sort of difficulty at first, but we hung in there collectively and those schools are doing quite well. So that was sort of that hybrid open choice magnet transition period. So that has been done in the past. In terms of going forward, I think it's a little bit difficult to talk about some of the things that we've been talking about just because of the nature of some of the negotiations. But I think we all agree that we're sort of on the precipice of having to do something different. I mean, when we did the new agreement in 2008, we were all charged up going forward, very aggressive, and we were sort of emulating what we thought was a new model, but that model was just more aggressive building on what had been done previously. And now we're at the point where things have to, there's just so many buildings And now something has to change in terms of how we look at chaff. And one of the things that we had talked about with these co-locations, is there an opportunity, sort of what you're talking about, to use that cohabitation in a way to offer desegregation opportunities. And we have to start looking at different ways of bringing students together and increasing integration in a way that just doesn't look like, you know, a magnet school alone. So I think that's a really important discussion that we've already started having, but look forward to having as we go forward, so that we're in a sustainable system, because this has got to go on for many, many years to come. And right now we see, just based upon the charts, you see we're sort of pittering downward, and Hartford's not alone. This is a shared problem with Craig and Goodwin and the other operators as well. They're all struggling with the changing demographics of the region. So it's a shared opportunity to look at things more creatively, more innovatively, to the benefit of students, I think.
So I will say this though, and I'll just speak for myself. One of the things that I can not do in good conscience is discriminate against black and brown students anymore. We can't do that. So we need to continue discussions and come up with ideas and solutions, because we have generations of children and generations of people in our city that have been disenfranchised. And we, in moving towards a more cohesive system, what I don't want to see is we work in silos again. And I think we've been working in silos thus far. We've been looking at portions instead of the whole. And I'm afraid that we're going to get lost in that discussion again. So, for example, my efforts are not primarily about or for reduced isolation or integration. My efforts are primarily about quality education for every student. And it's about making sure that every student, especially our students in our neighborhoods, have access to quality education within walking distance of their homes, so that we can build capacity in our community, so we can build community again. And so that is part of what I hope doesn't get lost in discussion, because again, the unintended consequences have been around for years, and I understand we all are concerned about it, but I really just want to make sure that we have a concerted effort to talk about the elephant in the room. I think you guys have been gracious, and I've enjoyed having you. I'm very grateful that you're here, and I hope you continue to come, so we can have dialogue, and hopefully we can add people and have more conversation with all parties, and that way we can do what's right for children, because this is about children. This is not about adults. This is not about egos. This is about children and the future of Hartford. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to ensure that Hartford has a quality school system, that we are producing competent adults that can work at Travelers or Edna. So we're trying to build a workforce, and we're trying to move Hartford into the 21st century. So, and the other question I have, I'm sorry, I did a little editorial, forgive me. Going back to the students from Puerto Rico, will they have access to magnet schools? Because right now, coming in mid-year, they don't. So how do we ensure that they have an equal opportunity to have access to magnet schools?
Or any student.
Or any student, that comes in mid-year.
Well, that's certainly a critical issue to add to the growing list of important things. Yeah, I know.
I'm sorry.
It's the lawyer broken record thing where we say thanks for adding the issue, but we don't answer it. Look, I can speak generally about McKinney-Vento kids who have been classified as McKinney-Vento, and I think as Charlene can also comment on, and as the district has been really on top of, it's generally our expectation that students displaced by a natural disaster would classify as protected under McKinney-Vento. And McKinney-Vento, we're looking at this, McKinney-Vento carries protections for those kids, that they receive equal treatment in special programming like magnets. The question becomes, when you have the timing where there's a lottery that's happened earlier and now the students are coming in later. How do we address that? It's certainly something that we would want to work with Hartford on. There's the added complexity of the issue that you were just commenting on, Mr. Chairman, which is the reduced isolation standard. But that's certainly an issue that we want to engage in brainstorming on. It's challenging. It's a challenging issue. But there are federal law McKinney-Vento implications of it. So, you know, we want to work on it.
I guess, and then the second part of that question is we've lost some Title I, Title II funds federally. So you answered the question. I'm just going to ask again, forgive me. But do we really expect federal funds to come with these students?
I'm going to let my esteemed colleague Charlene Russell Tucker speak to that. It's not a joke. She's actually more familiar with the specifics.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you all for the invitation. I just to say this has been great dialogue with students at the center of the decision making. So thank you for that. As you know, it's a great question about funding, and I mentioned earlier from my call out that while we do not have state resources right now positioned to support our 1,883 students, because that's what we have through the end of the year who've come into Connecticut, we're heartened with the dialogue, the discussion that's happening actually in Washington. And I've seen language, so Congress actually has a bill in front of them that they're looking at for support for our students, and actually not just for Puerto Rico, but they're also looking for a carve-out to support our districts here that have taken in students. And in preparing for that, the department actually did a survey of districts not too long ago, just trying to get more information on the breakdown for kids. The draft language that I've seen federally has different funding amounts allocated for students who are considered homeless under McKinney-Vento, also funding for students who are considered English learners, and I think there's a third category of funding. So we're hopeful. We've been having conversation, of course, with our congressional delegation so they can help support and drive that through at the federal level. So we're hoping, we're really hoping that we will be able to see that. And so we're continuing to collect data at the state level so that we can be positioned when that happens, which we're hoping that it will, that we can get the resources out to our districts that's supporting our students. Hartford, and thank you for all your welcoming work here in the city, because you're the leader of the pack with the numbers of students. At last count, it was 388 students that are 398 now, so the numbers are going up. So Hartford is out in front, and so I've had conversations with your superintendent because we also have students who've come in who have suffered trauma. Right? They've come out of traumatic situations, and so besides the resources that we know you critically need, I know Hartford has done a great job partnering with other organizations to make sure that those non-academic needs are also being addressed for students coming in. And so we continue to work with our districts, collecting the information and also providing supports. At the department, we've also worked on some resources if we have folks who've been displaced to our teachers. How do we get them certified and in the system? And so we've developed some protocols around that as well. So we're trying very hard. We're now working on guidance around graduation because we have about 60 plus students who are 12th graders. What do we do then about graduation? So we're doing that work as well. So at the state level, we don't necessarily have immediate resources to provide, but we're trying to provide some other types of support to our districts, and we're really working hard to see what we can get from Washington.
Oh, thank you. So please come back and provide us an update on that. And so as I'm going to pivot, we have maybe one more thing. So as I pivot and we're talking about these students from Puerto Rico, they will again be a part of student population, the highest needs pretty much in the state. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot, forgive me. But I have a ringer in the audience, Katie Roy, from the Connecticut School Finance Project. So if you can please come and sort of give us a small synopsis about concentration of need and anything you feel relevant to this discussion, we would appreciate it. And again, could you just introduce yourself for the record, please?
Hi, my name is Katie Roy. I'm the director and founder of the Connecticut School Finance Project. At this point, I'm not really sure what there is to cover that hasn't been covered pretty thoroughly by this Board of Ed. I'm so glad to see all of the folks from the state here, and I think ERS has done a great job with the data. I really do think you've covered a lot of the significant issues here. Do you have specific questions for me that you want me to discuss?
Do you have a funding formula?
Well, I don't want to get into the FOIM formula and CJF and all the rest of that stuff, but if you can simply just talk about the state budget trends, what we're looking at in terms of deficit and cutting, and just what you think is relevant.
Yeah, so I think, as all of you know, Connecticut passed its biennium budget for fiscal years 18, the current year we're in, and 19 at the end of October. According to the Comptroller's Office, that budget is currently $224 in deficit for this year. We don't know what that will mean yet for deficit mitigation plan, although we did get some good news today that it looks like the income tax returns are up, at least for the month of December, although it's not totally clear whether that's because of the changes in the federal tax law, if there's more income coming in. So it's not really clear what the implications of that will be yet. So I think at the moment, until the legislature comes back into session, there are going to continue to be a number of unknowns about what the budget is going to look like going forward. The consensus revenue numbers, which are the agreements between the Office of Fiscal Analysis and the Office of Policy and Management about what they project revenues will look like for the rest of the year, will come out on January 16th, and I know that I and all of the folks at the state will be eagerly awaiting those consensus revenue figures to see what they look like, and then surely the legislature will be making plans from there, both about the budget for the remainder of this fiscal year and next year's fiscal year 19 budget.
Thank you. And I guess my last question again is high concentration of need, and how is that a trend that's going up? Is it going down? Do you think, in terms of our plans, what do you think, in your opinion, in terms of finance, what we should be doing and what we should be looking at?
So concentration of need, we've certainly seen concentrations of need increase in Hartford, and I think tonight you did a good job, everyone did, of touching on the fact that need is increasing in the greater Hartford region. The greater Hartford region looks substantially different today than it did when the Sheff lawsuit was decided, and that continues to change, and that's obviously going to have an impact going forward on what demographics in the greater Hartford area look like. I think we've seen that trend happen, and I think we expect to see that trend continue into the future. On our website, you can actually take a look at the changes in low-income students as identified by free and reduced price lunch at the district level over the last 10-year period. There's an interactive graphic there, but you'll see by and large that need is increased not only in the greater Hartford area, but generally throughout the state. We generally don't comment on the plans of boards of education regarding, school closures or openings or how districts distribute money to their schools, so I'm not going to comment on those things, but I'm certainly glad to see the Hartford Public Schools Board of Ed doing this work, and we're certainly eagerly watching to see the result.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much. Okay, so no other questions or comments? No other questions for ERS? All right, well, I just want to thank everyone. Oh, Madam Superintendent.
Can I get my clicker back? Thanks, Dave. Just want to wrap it up before we move on to next steps. So, want to wrap up the conversation around magnets. The recommendations for magnet schools outside of relocations and co-locations were not part of my proposals, primarily because of the conversation that you just heard and the complexity that exists for us to try to address, unpack, and find solutions for the issue in isolation. And so I just want to reference the rationale behind not having recommendations for magnets outside of those co-locations. Clearly, as we were hoping, as I was hoping as superintendent, right, to have an opportunity today to begin to solidify the foundation in terms of the partnerships moving forward, so that we can collectively try to, address the challenge that we as an operator and as a school district face with regard to magnets. And so moving forward in our next steps and our commitment, we are going to continue to look at data and the implications. Certainly plan for smooth and supportive transitions if any of the recommendations that I've made are accepted and voted on. And we want to make sure that we work closely with, of course, our unions, our leaders. We know that we want to ensure transitions for staff, for our students, for our families, our communities and our partners in a way that, again, lifts voice and meets the needs of our respective communities. And regarding staff, we know that the relationship between teachers, students, and families, right, is at the center of this process. And so we want to maintain and continue to build those strong relationships. And so with that said, the recommendations that I have made do highlight efficiencies as one area that we could generate savings over time for potential reinvestment in our students. And so as I shared earlier, reinvestment possibilities do include the expansion of those resources, right? Resources in terms of people, time, and money to ensure that we meet and address those non-negotiables. And so ERS did look at some of our attrition rates, and like all districts, Hartford Public Schools, for a variety of reasons, does have attrition every year, retirements, professional advancements, position eliminations, but our attrition rates, according to the data, do show that effective staff will likely still have will have a home here with us in our district. So I wanted to lift that. I do have data available should you want it. I can make it available with regard to, we're going back to the last 5 years, if you will, in terms of our attrition data, how many staff leave our district, how many positions we reduce based on financial challenges that we have. And so fairly confident that staff will have a place, will have a place home here with us. So I wanted to lift that. And of course, we're going to continue to engage in conversation with our bargaining units as to additional thinking that they might have for staff and who are impacted. Certainly after the vote, we shift to our implementation phase, which entails strategic school design teams and also transition teams, making sure that the school design teams are collaborative. They plan for not only program needs, but also takes into account the resources that are needed and ensure that we have the structures and the conditions in place to carry out the work. And also transition teams, yes, making sure that they are collaborative, that they support all aspects of a transition, that we at the district have the capacity and are structured in a way that supports our students and our families and our communities, and that we continue to build relationships and a sense of community. For staff, students, and families, we certainly have some ideas. Some of these have already been informed by families and community-based conversations as to how we can help foster smooth transitions. As you know, there are a number of upcoming opportunities for engagement, including tomorrow, a district public hearing per policy for any and all comments with regard to any of the recommendations, followed by specific school-based hearings for those schools that are recommended for closure. So Capital Community College Magnet Academy is a magnet school that we phased out that's currently located at Capital Prep. We will have a hearing specifically for that school, as well as for Simpson Waverly Batchelder. And then we also have some community conversations as well. What we have certainly have gotten a lot of questions and wonderings that we've collected, and so we'll go back during these community conversations and offer those questions and the answers to those questions and trends, and certainly collect more of your questions. So making sure that we maintain the integrity of our commitment around making sure that we have voice throughout this process. And that concludes.
Okay, well, thank you. So this concludes our data presentation for tonight. You know, I understand that it illuminated a lot of interest and other challenges that we may be facing. I think the board would be better served if we continue to collect more data, have more conversation, and get more presentations around magnet schools and how we can either help or reshape or rethink the way that we're doing magnet schools. As you can see, we are committed to creating a district that is founded on excellence, and that is through quality education and building community, and supporting one another and having schools that are embedded in our community and reflect who we are as a city. So I just want to thank everyone for coming, and I'm going to ask the superintendent if we can have a larger conversation around this issue. So we need to plan more, whether it's a workshop or small community groups. It doesn't make a difference. I'll leave that to her. She talked about and acknowledged the stakeholders, so I'm not going to do that. I don't want to keep everybody because we've been here long enough. But I truly just want to say thank you for coming out. Thank you for attempting to be informed consumers and getting information so that you can disseminate that and have an intelligent conversation, whatever your community, your respective communities you come from. So again, on behalf of the board, thank you for coming. Thank you for attending. Drive home safely and have a great night.
Thank you.
Our workshop is adjourned.
Saludos, estoy orgullosa de ser su superintendente, la doctora Leslie Torres Rodríguez. Estoy dirigiendo el proceso crucial de reimaginar y reestructurar nuestro distrito escolar. Necesito que ustedes, todos ustedes, tengan una participación significativa en nuestro proceso. Estamos haciendo esta labor crucial para cumplir nuestro compromiso, garantizar mejores resultados para los estudiantes y un acceso equitativo a los recursos para todos y cada uno de nuestros estudiantes hermosos y competentes. Cuando hayamos completado este proceso juntos, tendremos en nuestras manos un distrito escolar más fuerte y más equitativo, diseñado para servir bien a todos los estudiantes, y un plan construido por toda la comunidad para el beneficio de toda la comunidad. Nosotros en las escuelas públicas de Hartford estamos coordinando este proceso, pero ustedes, la comunidad, las familias, los estudiantes, los maestros y todos nuestros socios son las voces y las mentes que orientan este trabajo. Al compartir sus opiniones, ustedes ayudarán a crear nuestro modelo del distrito. Nuestro trabajo en conjunto, que se llevará a cabo durante los próximos meses en reuniones comunitarias con familias, socios y escuelas, culminará con la presentación de recomendaciones para modelos de excelencia del distrito. Estos modelos demostrarán diferentes maneras en que el distrito puede ser reimaginado, tomando en consideración la condición y viabilidad de nuestros vecindarios y garantizando el acceso continuo de oportunidades y servicios a nuestras familias y estudiantes. Para obtener más noticias sobre este proceso, visite nuestra página del web del distrito en el www.hartfordschools.org.